The Statue of Liberty underwent renovation in the mid-1980s. Its torch replaced, its iron armature repaired, its copper skin examined for the first time since 1886. The scaffolding made the monument temporarily visible as a structure rather than a symbol. The 1936 Berlin Olympics torch relay was invented by the Nazi regime as a propaganda tool, connecting ancient Greece to modern Germany through a ceremonial flame. Leni Riefenstahl filmed it. The image of athletic purity concealed what was already happening to German Jews. Boyhood in a coal hole in 1954. Thurston Hopkins photographing London's post-war poverty in the specific domestic architecture of a city whose working-class neighborhoods still contain spaces that children claimed as their own regardless of what the space was originally designed for. Then got haircuts outside a plantation store in the Mississippi Delta. Music in 1939 after being paid on Saturday. The plantation economy's specific geography making the store the center of every transaction, including this one. The barber came to where the money was. The most likely last photograph of Hitler was taken around March 20th, 1945, 6 weeks before his suicide in the bunker. He stands in his garden inspecting something. The posture still attempts authority. The war had 41 days remaining. Lee Miller washed in Hitler's bathtub on April 30th, 1945. The war correspondent who had photographed the liberation of Dachau hours earlier documented in Munich in the specific act of occupying the most private space of the man whose regime she had just watched destroyed. Otto von Habsburg looked at the Berlin Wall in 1960, the last crown prince of Austria-Hungary, contemplating a barrier built through a city his empire had once influenced. 1 year after the wall's construction, an heir to a dissolved world, examining a new one being physically divided. A newborn lamb snuggled against a sleeping boy in 1940. The domestic farm moment that required music. No occasion except the specific warmth that a small animal seeks and a sleeping child provides without knowing it. Both were unaware of being photographed. Grid girls posed to the Hungarian Formula One Grand Prix in Budapest in 1986. The first Hungarian Grand Prix held behind the Iron Curtain in a country where Western motorsport had never previously raced. The girls in the crowd were both experiencing something the decade had made newly possible. A man carried his exhausted wife and child away from German-occupied Minsk on August 9th, 1941, hatred visible in his face. According to the original caption, the photograph is one of the war's most direct documents of what occupation looked like from inside the occupied. Dachau was liberated by the U.S. 7th Army on April 29, 1945. Approximately 32,000 survivors freed from the first Nazi concentration camp, which had operated since 1933. At least 41,500 people had died there. The liberating soldiers were not prepared for what they found. The Boron spacecraft was assembled in Munich, the USSR in the 1980s. The Soviet space shuttle that flew autonomously in 1988 without a crew. Its autopilot being cutting-edge technology the American shuttle didn't use. It completed one orbital flight and was never flown again. A U.S. soldier was photographed in the Afghan desert in 2002, 1 year after the invasion that followed September 11th in the country where the Soviet Union had fought a decade-long war that ended in withdrawal. The American War lasted 20 years. President Kennedy met Helen Keller in the Oval Office on April 8, 1961. The president who had been in office 3 months, meeting the woman who had been famous since 1903. She was 80 years old. She communicated through touch. The meeting lasted longer than protocol required. A Nepalese man carried a kakri tucked in his turban in 1967. The curved blade of the Gurkha warrior worn as ordinary daily equipment by a man for whom the knife was simply a tool. The photograph documents the blade's cultural normality in a context that makes it extraordinary to outside eyes. Demonstrators gathered in Bucharest University Square in 1990 near signs choosing between communism and liberty months after the execution of the Cescas. Romania still negotiating what the revolution had produced. The signs made the choice explicit. The demonstration was evidence the choice was still being contested. Maria Vladimir of Romanova visited Georgia in 1995. The claimant to the Russian imperial throne, visiting a former Soviet republic that had declared independence 4 years earlier. The visit documented a dynastic claimant moving through a political landscape that had reorganized itself beyond any throne's reach. It below led an armada of flying boats to Shediac, New Brunswick, Music in 1933. The Italian Air Force minister commanding a mass transatlantic formation flight that demonstrated Italian aviation capability. He was received as a hero. The fascist regime that sent him considered the flight a propaganda success. Montana Governor Mark Rascott passed death row inmate. Music Duncan McKenzie in 1995. McKenzie had pleaded innocence in a face-to-face meeting. Rascott concluded he was lying and refused to intervene. McKenzie was executed 2 days later. The photograph documents the last meeting between the two men. Emily Gale promoted Detroit with a Say Nice Things Music About Detroit campaign in the early 1980s, standing outside her downtown store during deindustrialization. Detroit needed the campaign because the conditions requiring it were visible from the same storefront where she was photographed making the argument. Women finished their Pennsylvania dry dock shift in 1943. Wartime labor, opening industrial positions to women that returning veterans would reclaim within 2 years. They worked the same shifts in the same conditions. The post-war economy classified their contribution as temporary regardless of its permanence. During the war, a severely malnourished Nigerian refugee was photographed in a camp near the Baffin War Zone in the late 1960s. The blockade's famine killing between 1 and 3 million people. The photographs of starving Baffin children changed how international humanitarian organizations documented and responded to mass starvation. New York's Maltese community presented a scroll of appreciation to President Roosevelt in the Oval Office in 1944, reciprocating his wartime tribute to Malta's resistance during the German and Italian siege. Roosevelt received the delegation personally. The scroll acknowledged what the tribute had meant to an island under bombardment. Bernie Sanders was arrested while protesting segregation in Chicago in 1963 at 21. The photograph, documenting political convictions, present from the beginning before any office was sought, before any name recognition existed. The arrest record preceded the Senate record by 43 years. William Casby was born into slavery in Virginia in 1857 and was photographed by Richard Avedon in 1963, holding his great-great-granddaughter, 106 years old, a longshoreman who lived to 113. The 4 generations in the frame span American history, from slavery to the civil rights movement. The Peets family was photographed in Lorton, Oklahoma in 1913, for years before America entered the First World War, 7 years before women could vote, assembled for a portrait in the specific formal posture the early 1900s required when someone arrived with a camera. Zaduka photographed a father and daughter in Bamako, Mali around 1950. The Moralian photographer whose archive the art world eventually recognized as one of the 20th century's most significant, treating his community with the same dignity European portrait photographers reserve for European subjects. President Kennedy and Ivory Coast President Felix Hewitt-Bogney rode together in a bubble-top limousine on May 22, 1962. The African leader state visit to Washington, representing the new nations emerging from colonialism, whose Cold War alignment both superpowers were actively competing to determine. Women prisoners at Dao laughed or cried uncontrollably at liberation on April 29, 1945. The specific emotional response of people whose bodies had registered freedom before their minds had processed what it meant. Years of confinement ended in a single moment that the nervous system experienced as overwhelming. NFL player David Thomas was photographed with his son during practice in 2009. The domestic moment that professional athletes experience in the specific geography of their workplace. The child in the practice field, while the father works both in the same space for entirely different reasons. Behind-the-scenes photographs from A Knight's Tale in 200201 document the production that combined medieval tournament settings with contemporary rock music. Heath Ledger's first major leading role photographed in the gap between takes. The production designing a Middle Ages that Queen's music had apparently always belonged to. Bookmobile traveled to rural northwestern Ontario in 1958. The vehicle being the library for communities too small and remote for permanent buildings. The children who came out to meet it had no other access. The books arrived on a schedule. The children were always there when they did. Ethel Kennedy held newborn Rory Kennedy on December 12, 1968. The child born after her father, Robert Kennedy's assassination in June. Ted Kennedy stands music beside them. Rory never knew her father. She became a documentary filmmaker. The photograph documents a beginning that the preceding 6 months made specifically painful. Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner met in 1943 while she was married to Mickey Rooney. They married in 1951, 72 hours after Music Sinatra's D. A divorce from Nancy Barbato was finalized. The marriage lasted 6 years and was described by both of them as the most important relationship of their lives. Cheever's 1966 passport documented him in disguise under false name. The revolutionary who had left Cuba secretly was traveling as a Uruguayan businessman. The disguise allowed him to reach Bolivia, where he was captured and executed in October 1967. The passport predates his death by 1 year. The Carl Zeiss factory assembly line in Jena, East Germany in the 1950s produced optical instruments under socialist management. The company that had been divided by the post-war partition, one half in West Germany, one in East Germany, both continuing to make lenses under the same name for different political systems. President Kennedy played with JFK Jr. Caroline and their pony Macaroni at the White House in 1962. The photographs of the Kennedy children playing in the Oval Office becoming some of the most reproduced images of his presidency. The domestic joy visible in every frame, making the subsequent loss more acute. The 14th Dalai Lama was photographed at age 2 in 1937. Tenzin Gyatso identified as the Dalai Lama's reincarnation after the previous one's death, music, in 1933. Photographed 4 years before his formal enthronement in 1940. He remains the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism at age 90. The Sasebo 2nd Special Naval Landing Forces celebrated after occupying a position in Jab, Shanghai, in October 1937. The Japanese forces that have been fighting Chinese nationalist troops since August in the Battle of Shanghai that would kill 200,000 soldiers and tens of thousands of civilians. Freed American P. Jack Gates kicked a Japanese guard at Roroshi Camp in September 1945. A moment of revenge his daughter said he later regretted. He had been a prisoner throughout the war. The guard had had authority over him throughout. The regret lasted longer than the kick. Jennifer Sophia Martelis disappeared on November 15, 1982. Her school photograph taken the same day, she vanished at age 7. She has never been found. No one has been charged. The photograph taken that morning is the last image that exists of her alive. Foul play is suspected. Rocky Marciano overcame severe music blood loss to knock out Ezzard Charles in their 1954 rematch. Some consider it the greatest heavyweight bout in history. Charles was the only fighter who truly tested the undefeated champion. Martino won and remained music 49-0 through retirement. Burial at sea was conducted aboard USS Hancock off Okinawa on April 9, 1945 for sailors killed in a Japanese attack 2 days earlier. The ocean receiving men the ship could no longer carry. The ceremony brief and specific, the sea permanent in the way the ship was not. The Unisphere from a 1964 to 65 New York World's Fair still stands in Flushing Meadows. The stainless steel globe commissioned as a symbol of world peace through global trade. Photographed in 1965 as the centerpiece of a fair that promised a future. Its actual decades delivered only partially. For French partisans carried a portrait of de Gaulle in 1942. The image of their exiled leader serving as both symbol and declaration. the face representing the alternative to Vichy that the partisans were risking their lives to make actual. The portrait was the flag they couldn't carry openly. Robin Williams posed with Raquel Welch for the Moj and Mindy episode Morgue vs. the Necrodons on November 18, 1979. The comedian at the peak of his television popularity and the actress who had become a cultural icon in the 1960s sharing a frame that required nothing except both of them being present. A couple admired the Chrysler Building from the street below the Art Deco Tower, completed in 1930 and briefly the world's tallest building before the Empire State Building surpassed it 11 months later. The building they're looking at lost its height record before the year it was built had ended. Women wore fire masks in Downshire Hill, London in 1941. Protective equipment designed for gas attacks that the Blitz had made standard issue for civilians navigating streets during and after bombing raids. The masks were carried daily. The gas attacks never came. The bombs did. Chisato Moritaka announced her pregnancy, marriage to Yosagachi, and retirement from music in March 1999. The Japanese singer stepping away from a career at its commercial peak. She returned to music in 2004. The 1999 retirement announcement proved temporary, but was treated at the time as permanent. And Edge Polinsky stood 7 feet tall and was photographed in his 1972 mugshot after a drug arrest. The height making the booking photograph both a criminal record and an inadvertent portrait of someone whose physical scale the standard booking camera format was not designed to accommodate. A young Mexican carrot worker ate his second breakfast in a Texas field near Santa Maria in 1939. Tortillas, fried onions, and cold coffee being the typical lunch of Mexican agricultural workers in the Depression-era Southwest. The meal was taken in the field because the field didn't stop for meals. The oldest church in the United States is San Miguel Mission in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Built around 1610 by Tilax gallon workers brought from Mexico City, predating the Pilgrims' arrival at Plymouth Rock by a decade. The building has been continuously used for religious purposes for over 4 centuries. Child coal miners in West Virginia were photographed in 1908. Boys working in mines that employed them legally and extensively before federal child labor legislation was passed. Lewis Hine documented these children systematically as evidence for reform that took another 24 years to arrive as federal law. Abraham Lincoln was photographed with Ralph Lincoln, an 11th-generation Lincoln and third cousin of the president, connecting the family name to the man who bore it, most famously through the biological chain of a family that continued long after the assassination that made the name historical rather than personal. An undercover officer apprehended a mugger on the New York subway in 1985. Bruce Davidson photographing the transit system's crime problem during the period when subway crime generated genuine public fear. The city's subway carried 900 million riders annually through a system the police couldn't adequately cover. U.S. Army soldier Ivan Babcock wore the Holy Roman Empire crown in a German cave on April 3, 1945. The crown and other treasures stored there to protect them from Allied bombing. Babcock's photograph was taken in the interval between the cave's capture and the treasures returned to proper custody. Sally SDRS and Peter Falk were photographed at Dodgers Stadium around 1973. The All in the Family actress and the Columbo detective sharing bleacher seats in the specific casual intersection of 2 people who inhabited the same industry's social geography and happened to attend the same game. The original T.H. Harry's company cast posed in 1979. John Ritter, Joyce Ditt, and Suzanne Summers playing roommates whose comic misunderstandings drove a show that ran 7 seasons. The series was the most watched show on American television in its peak years. The premise required everyone to consistently misinterpret everything. The White House kitchen in 1891 documented the infrastructure supporting an institution that hosted heads of state, the equipment, the scale, and the specific organization of a professional kitchen serving presidential functions in the Gilded Age. When the White House staff cooked everything from scratch for every occasion. The home of Blind Tom Foley at Madison Avenue and 77th Street in New York was photographed on May 11, 1891. The specific domestic address of a family documented in the city's visual record at a time when Manhattan's Upper East Side was still a mixed-income neighborhood in transition. The mouth of the Chicago River in 1831 was sketched by Mrs. Kinsey and later illustrated. Fort Dearborn, sitting on the south bank, the Kinsey House across the water, and the small frontier settlement that would become one of America's largest cities, just beginning to organize itself around the river. Walter Crane illustrated the nursery rhyme 1-2 Buckle My Shoe in 1869. The children's illustrator who would become central to the arts and crafts movement, producing work that treated the nursery rhyme as worthy of the same artistic attention given to serious subject matter. The Fat Hen is on page 10. The story of capturing Lincoln's most dangerous assassin in Egypt documents a fugitive hunt that crossed an ocean. John Serret fled to Europe, joined the Papal Zouaves, was recognized in Rome, escaped, was captured in Egypt in 1866, returned to America for trial, and was ultimately acquitted on a hung jury. Stevie Nicks was photographed backstage at Oakland Stadium on May 1, 1976. Fleetwood Mac was on a Fleetwood Mac album tour, music released earlier that year. The album that would make them one of the world's biggest bands, Rumors, was being written. The backstage photograph precedes its recording by months. Iron Maiden made their debut in East London on May 1, 1976. The band that Paul Di'Anno was fronting before Steve Harris recruited Bruce Dickinson before Number of the Beast before the global tour. The first show happened in a pub. The global career that followed was not yet imaginable. Muhammad Ali faced Jimmy Young on April 30, 1976. A fight Ali won by unanimous decision, but in which he performed below his peak. The judges' scores being close enough to suggest Young had been more competitive than Ali expected. Ali was 34. The era of his dominance was ending. Johnny Gosch disappeared while delivering newspapers in West Des Moines in September 1982. The 12-year-old's case becoming one of the most prominent missing child cases in American history and a catalyst for milk carton missing child campaigns. Highest mother claimed he visited her 15 years later. The claim was never verified. Rydelic used his condition as an advantage during the 2020 Izmia earthquake rescue operations. His specific physical capability, allowing him to navigate music-collapsed building spaces that standard rescue workers couldn't access, saving lives through an ability that his condition had produced and that the emergency required. The Pirate carpet from the 5th century BC is the oldest known surviving carpet found in a Scion burial mound in Siberia in 1949, preserved by ice for 2,500 years. Its knotting density and design complexity indicate it was produced by skilled craftspeople, not nomadic herders. American bison were reduced from 36 million animals to fewer than 1,000 by 1880. The deliberate decimation coordinated between the U.S. Army and commercial hunters as explicit policy to destroy the Plains tribes' food supply and economic foundation. The policy was successful. The bison nearly weren't. Pacific stargazer buries itself in the seabed with only its upward-facing eyes and mouth exposed. An ambush predator that generates electric charges and waits for prey to swim overhead before striking. The eyes face up. The prey doesn't see what's below until it's already too late. Al Lewis played Grandpa Monster on The Monsters from 1964 to 1966. The comedian who also played Officer Mullen on Car 54, creating one of television's most beloved character actors, Music, in a role that required him to be genuinely funny inside a rubber monster suit. He was born this date in 1923. Ted Cassidy played Lurch on The Addams Family, and Sher Jackson appeared in the Star Trek episode What a Little Girl's Made Of. Both actors known for playing artificial beings photographed together in what the caption describes as an android pairing that the casting history of both actors made specific. The classroom job of line leader, board eraser, or supply distributor was elementary school's first democratic institution. The assignment rotating weekly, giving every child their moment of minor authority in a classroom that was otherwise organized entirely around the teacher's hierarchy. Everyone remembers which job they wanted most. German actress Elga Anderson starred in Run, Psycho, Run in 1968, the German exploitation film that required its title to contain both its genre and its directive. The actress navigating a career in German cinema of the late 1960s that operated in the gap between art house and grindhouse. Steve McQueen aimed a pistol in his living room in 1963. The actor who built his celebrity around physical competence and genuine danger photographed in the domestic space where the performance could be put down. He is still performing it. Some people don't stop when the camera appears. A woman secretly photographed the U.S. Supreme Court in session in 1937 through a hole in her handbag, one of only 2 illegal photographs ever taken inside the court during a session. She was Eric Salomon's daughter-in-law. Photography had been banned after Salomon's 1932 photograph caused controversy. Arnold Schwarzenegger became a U.S. citizen in September 1983, completing naturalization in the same month Terminator was released, the film that converted him from a bodybuilding celebrity into a global star. Both events happened in September 1983. The photograph documents the citizenship. The film created what followed. The Art Deco Mercury Streamliner of 1936 was designed by Henry Dreyfuss for the New York Central Railroad, the locomotive that made industrial design and transportation aesthetics inseparable. Its chrome nose and streamlined body influencing everything from household appliances to automotive design. In the decade following its debut, a whale slipped beneath the surface of Argentina's Peninsula Valdez, the right whale breeding ground that hosts one of the world's most studied whale populations. The specific moment of submersion captured in a photograph that makes visible the animal's scale relative to the water receiving it. The CTP, one robot participated in the Chernobyl cleanup in Pripyat in 1986. Remotech controlled machines sent to do what humans couldn't safely do for long, working on the reactor roof to clear radioactive debris. The radiation levels eventually damaged the robot's electronics, requiring human workers to replace them. The picture was demonstrated in Stuttgart in 1965. The technology allowing users to see the person they were speaking to having been prototyped decades before video calling became universal. The demonstration was accurate about the technology's eventual arrival. It was wrong about the timeline by approximately 30 years. The British royal family hunted tigers in India in 1911. The sport of empire requiring dozens of beaters to drive animals toward royal guns. The kills were photographed as achievements. The tigers were not consulted about their role in the occasion. The practice continued until public opinion chat. Jared Darling Harbour in Sydney was photographed in 1878. The working harbour before its conversion into the tourist and entertainment precinct. It became after the 1988 bicentennial redevelopment. The 1878 photograph shows a functional industrial waterfront whose commercial purpose the subsequent century would completely replace. The SO Northumbria was the largest ship ever built in the UK when Swan Hunter launched it at Wallsend in 1969. The very large crude carrier representing the peak of British ship-building ambition before North Sea oil, Japanese competition, and economic decline dismantled the industry within a decade. The SS Leviathan was fitted with a new propeller in February 1929, 8 months before the stock market crash that would devastate the passenger shipping industry. The ship had been renamed and refitted multiple times. The propeller carried her through the Depression and eventually to the scrapyard. British troops tore down a fascist monument in Kismio, Italian Somaliland in 1941. The physical removal of the colonial regime's symbolic infrastructure being part of the East African campaign that ended Italian colonial rule in the Horn of Africa. The monument came down. The colonialism it represented had already collapsed. A young woman rode a skateboard while wearing roller skates during the late 1970 skateboard craze. The specific combination suggesting she had both pairs of wheels and was using them simultaneously for reasons the photograph makes self-evident. The skateboard craze peaked around 1977 and declined sharply by 1982. Couple posed with their car in the 1920s. The automobile still new enough that ownership was an occasion worth documenting. The car and the couple both presented to the camera with the specific pride of people who understood that what they were standing beside represented something worth being photographed beside. Jane Russell was photographed at the beach around 1941 to 42, before Howard Hughes cast her in The Outlaw and launched a marketing campaign around her figure that made her famous before the film was released. The beach photograph predates the machinery that would convert her into something the studio could sell. A couple danced at a Pittsburgh nightclub in the 1950s, photographed in the specific ease of people who had decided the evening was for dancing and were conducting it accordingly. Pittsburgh in the 1950s had nightclubs. This one had a photographer. Both facts were required for the photograph to exist. Adolf Hitler and his niece, Jelly Robbel, were photographed at a picnic in 1929. Hitler exercised possessive and toxic control over her life, restricting her movements and relationships. On September 18, 1931, she was found shot dead in their Munich apartment. No criminal charges were brought. War correspondents examined a bloodstained sofa by candlelight in the FUA bunker after Hitler's April 30, 1945 suicide. The journalists who had covered the war's final weeks, now inside the place where it ended for the man who started it. The blood and the candle and the sofa are the entire document. Harold Shipman murdered an estimated 250 or more patients over 23 years in Hyde. His 2000 trial covering only 15 deaths, approximately 5% of suspected victims. His near-perfect murders required a patient raising concerns to eventually expose him. He was convicted and died in prison in 2004. Barbara Mell was buried alive for nearly 4 days after being kidnapped in 1968. The 20-year-old Emory University student held in a fiberglass box buried underground. She survived because the kidnappers included an air supply and water. Her father paid $500,000 ransom. She was found alive. Shikaram Umbul held Amal Kassab in his arms while taking multiple AK-47 bullets during the 2008 Mumbai attacks. The unarmed assistant sub-inspector gripping the terrorist's weapon long enough for commandos to arrive and capture him. Kassab's subsequent trial and execution were possible because Umbul didn't let go.